Hey everyone, welcome back. Today, we're doing a deep dive into something that's been all over the news. And it's something I know is really important for those of you getting ready for those UPSC exams. It's the California wildfires in 2025. And these aren't like the typical fires you hear about, those summer ones. We're seeing these huge fires happening right now in January, which is usually the wettest time of year for California. The impact has been really bad. We're seeing evacuations. Sadly, there have even been some deaths. And it's even affected big events like the Oscars. Can you believe it? Even Paris Hilton had to leave her home. So these fires are a really big deal, and we're going to break down why they're happening, what it all means. To help us understand all of this, we have an expert with us today. They're here to explain the science behind these fires and what makes them so different from what we've seen before. So I'm really curious. All our sources talk about the weird timing of these fires, what's going on here. California is known for its dry summers and wildfires later in the year, not in the middle of winter.
Yeah, you're right to be surprised. We're seeing three major things coming together at the same time. And that's created kind of a perfect storm for these January wildfires. First, we need to look at the unusual weather patterns California has had over the past few years.
Okay, so you mean that shift from a really wet period to this sudden dryness we're seeing now, right? I remember reading about California getting record rainfall just a couple years ago.
Exactly. The winters of 2022 and 2023 were super wet, which meant a ton of vegetation grew. Imagine, grasslands just bursting with life, forests just packed with new undergrowth. But here's the problem. This winter has been incredibly dry, maybe even the driest on record, so all that lush vegetation. Instead of staying green and moist, dried out and became the perfect fuel for wildfires.
So it's like the state went from one extreme to the other, and all that dry stuff is just waiting for a spark.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. And we have this NASA report here. It highlights just how dry it's been. Southern California has had almost no rainfall since October. And Los Angeles is actually experiencing its driest start to a water year. That's the 12-month period starting October 1st, since 1944. It's pretty alarming.
Wow, a record dry spell.
Yeah.
In a place that's already known for being dry, that sounds serious. So we've got all this dry vegetation ready to burn. But something has to actually set it off right. What are we seeing in terms of what's causing these fires?
Well, investigations are still going on, but there's a good chance down power lines are to blame, combined with another major factor.
Okay, before we get to that second factor, let's pause for a second for our listeners. We hear about down power lines starting fires pretty often, but why are they such a big risk when things are so dry?
That's a really good question. It all comes down to how dry the vegetation is. Think of it this way. If a spark lands on moist green grass, that's probably not going to start a fire. But when that same spark lands on dry, brittle grass, it can ignite quickly and spread really fast.
So the dryness makes even small sparks much more dangerous.
Exactly. And this brings us to the second major factor at play here, the Santa Ana wines.
The Santa Ana winds.
Yeah.
Those are pretty famous in California, right? They always seem to come up when we hear about wildfires there.
Yeah, they're a big part of California's climate, and they're definitely playing a role in these fires.
Yeah.
But this year, they're especially strong, and that's just making things worse.
Okay, so for those of us who don't know California that well, can you explain where these winds come from and what makes them so dangerous?
Sure. So picture this vast high-altitude desert. It's called the Great Basin, and it sits east of California's mountains. The Santa Ana winds start from high-pressure systems in this area, and they blow west towards the Pacific Ocean.
So they're moving from high pressure to low pressure, right?
Yeah.
And don't they have to go over mountains too?
Exactly. As they come down the mountains and head for the coast, they get compressed and heated. This process squeezes out all the moisture, so they become incredibly dry. And as they squeeze through canyons and valleys, their speed really picks up.
Like a natural wind tunnel, creating these super dry, super fast winds.
That's a great way to think about it. We're talking wind speeds over 100 miles per hour, which is like hurricane force.
Wow, 100 miles an hour. And this is happening on top of those dry conditions we were talking about. No wonder these fires spread so fast and get so intense.
Yeah, it's a recipe for disaster, unfortunately. The Santa Ana winds are like this giant bellows, fanning the flames and pushing them across the land so quickly. And because they're so dry, they suck the moisture out of everything, which makes the vegetation even more flammable.
Oh, I've got the dry vegetation like kindling. The Santa Ana winds spreading the flames, and probably down to power lines, creating the initial spark. It all makes sense why these fires are so bad.
Right.
There's another big piece here, right? The elephant in the room, climate change.
You got it. Climate change is the backdrop for all of this. It's important to remember that climate change is what we call a threat multiplier.
What do you mean by threat multiplier?
It means climate change takes existing weather patterns and makes extreme events like these wildfires more frequent and more severe. Rising global temperatures mean warmer springs, earlier snowmelts, and longer, more intense dry seasons.
So climate change is basically setting the stage for these huge fires.
Exactly. Think of it this way. Climate change is loading the dice, making it more likely that we're going to roll that combination. That leads to these devastating fires.
This is all pretty serious stuff, but for those listening who are studying for the UPSC exams, this is all really important, right?
Absolutely. Understanding how climate change, weather patterns, and human actions all connect is crucial for anyone who wants to tackle these challenges in the future, whether it's through policy governance or disaster management.
So for those studying for the UPSC exams, this is like a real-world case study, showing how these issues play out. And it has implications for India too, doesn't it?
Yes, definitely. While India may not have the exact same geography or weather as California, the basic principles are the same. Climate change is a global problem, and its impacts, like the increased risk of wildfires, are felt all over the world.
So we've seen how this perfect storm, dry conditions, those strong winds, and most likely some human action too, have all come together to create this wildfire crisis in California. But it's not just about what's happening right now. It's about what this tells us about the future, especially with climate change. What lessons can we learn from all of this? Especially for those of you who want to use public policy to tackle these kinds of problems.
That's a really important question, and one that policymakers and future leaders really need to be thinking about. The California wildfires show us something. They show us that climate change isn't some far-off threat. It's happening right now, and it has real consequences.
So it's a wake-up call for everyone, not just people in California.
Absolutely. It highlights how urgent it is that we take action, proactive measures to reduce the risks that come with climate change. These fires show us how important it is to manage land sustainably, invest in infrastructure that can withstand these kinds of events, and develop early warning systems so we can be prepared and respond effectively.
So it's not just about putting out the fires, it's about addressing the root causes and making things more resilient.
Exactly. We need to shift from reacting to these events to preventing them in the first place. That means investing in research to develop building materials that can resist fire, promoting programs in communities to prevent fires, and creating defensible spaces around homes and communities.
These are all really important points, especially for those of you listening who are preparing for the UPSC exams. What's happening in California is a perfect example of the kinds of complex challenges you might face in your careers.
Exactly. This deep dive has highlighted topics that are relevant to disaster management, environmental policy, and even international cooperation. Understanding these connections and developing strategies to address them is going to be crucial for effective governance in a world that's increasingly affected by climate change.
So let's recap the key takeaways for everyone. The 2025 California wildfires are the result of a few things coming together. We had that unusual shift from really wet conditions to extremely dry conditions, and that created a ton of dry vegetation, just ready to burn.
Then you've got those powerful Santa Ana winds, known for how quickly they can spread fires and how intense they can make them. And behind all of this is climate change, making these extreme events more likely and more severe.
It's a complicated issue with consequences that reach far and wide. And that brings us to a really important question, especially for those of you who want to be future leaders. If climate change keeps getting worse, and scientists say it will, what can we do to get ready for future wildfires? And how can we lessen their impact?
That's the big question, isn't it? It's a question that needs our attention, our innovation, and our collective action to find solutions. We need to understand the science, analyze the socioeconomic factors, and create policies that are both effective and fair.
It's a challenge for sure, but it's also a chance to build a future that's more sustainable and resilient. And if you want to learn more about these complex global issues, make sure to hit that subscribe button. We've got a whole bunch of deep dives waiting for you, covering all sorts of things, from climate change and geopolitics to technology and economics.
And remember, knowledge is power. The more we understand these challenges, the better equipped we'll be to create a better future.
So until next time, keep those brains working and stay curious. And don't forget to like and share this episode with anyone who might find it interesting. We'll see you on our next deep dive.